So good evening, everybody. It's good to see everyone here this evening. We have a good number of people that have come. We've got some visitors who have come our way. I'm always happy when we have visitors that come to these public lectures that we have been doing now for a little while. My name is Stephen Baxley, and I'll be the speaker this evening, and we're going to get into that public lecture here in just a minute. Before we do that, though, I'd like to just point out that hopefully everybody, or at least every family group, got one of these papers when you came in. If you did not, there are some on the table in the foyer. If you would, even if you're a member here at Beach, if you would fill that out and drop that in the basket in the foyer, that would be great. Trying to get some feedback about these public lectures. And there's also, if you would like a printed copy of the lecture slides tonight, there's a place where you can indicate that as well, and give a mailing address so that we can get those mailed to you. I think the survey is probably pretty self-explanatory, but it'd be really good. And I'd appreciate it if you would fill that out and put that in the basket on your way out this evening or during the intermission so that we can kind of get a little bit of a feel for what it is that we're doing in these public lectures. Let me also explain, because obviously we're in a church building, and that's probably not escaped anybody's notice as you came in this evening that it's a church building. This, however, is not a church service. And so if you came in thinking that we'd sing a couple of songs and have a prayer and then have a lesson, we're not going to do that this evening. This is really a public lecture format, which simply means that I'm going to do a lot of talking. Hopefully, you're going to do a lot of asking of questions, because I like that kind of interplay during a lecture or during a Bible class. And we have Austin over there. He's sitting at the back. He has a portable microphone. So if during the course of the lectures you have some questions that you'd like to ask, all you need to do is raise your hand. You might wave a little bit at me, or Austin will see you, or I'll see you. We'll get the mic to you so that your question will be heard by everybody, and admittedly even by me this evening, so that I can hear your question as well. The lecture itself, I think, is going to go about 2 hours. We've listed everywhere that we're going to go from 6 to 8. I think that's about right. We will have an intermission about halfway through, okay? I always say about, because I'm not sure exactly where it'll be, but there'll be a slide for it. We'll take a 10-minute intermission in the course of this. I understand 2 hours is a long time to sit. If, however, you need to get up before the intermission, please feel free to do that. We have restrooms just off of the foyer there. Please feel free to avail yourselves of those. There's also a water fountain there in the foyer as well. We have a cry room for babies over on this side for mothers with babies. Fathers with babies, you can go to the technology room or one of the classrooms if you need to do that. But please make yourselves at home here this evening as we go through this information tonight. I will tell you that I presented this material first in Czech. I was in the Czech Republic about a month ago, and I presented this material first in Czech, so this is my first time to do it in English. I'm looking forward to, that's actually my second time to do it in English, but that's beside the point. I'm looking forward to doing it this evening in my native tongue, because I feel a little bit more comfortable with that than I do in a foreign language. But we're going to talk tonight about the death of Jesus. That's not a surprise, right? All of y'all knew that when you came here this evening. That's what we're going to talk about. But we're going to talk about this from a historical standpoint. We're going to use some Bible verses, and we're going to talk about some things that are in the Bible. But we're going to be looking at some historical artifacts as well, and some diagrams. I even have some things to share with you during the second half of this lecture this evening to try to gain a better appreciation of the death of Jesus and what Jesus went through, and from a historical standpoint, because it's not often something that we think about. We read what's in the Gospels, but the Gospels don't give us a lot of details about what all is involved. The Gospels, to a certain extent, assume a knowledge of what was involved, because for first century readers, they would have known what was involved in the death of Jesus. So that's what we're going to do this evening. I'd like to lay out a little bit what we're going to try to cover, at any rate, in the time that I have. We're going to talk a little bit about the date and the setting, okay? Not so much the setting, so much as the date of the death of Jesus. We're going to spend some time looking, actually probably a lot of time, looking at the individuals involved and the trials that Jesus went through leading up to his death. we're going to spend some time as well looking at crucifixion and what it involved. Actually, we're going to spend a lot of time looking at crucifixion and what that form of execution involved. We're also going to spend some time looking at the burial and the tomb of Jesus. And then finally this evening, what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about what the apostles preached after the death and the burial and the resurrection of Jesus. And so we're going to try to cover the entire breadth, if you will, of all of these topics. Now, I will also tell you that we are going to talk very briefly about the resurrection. However, I'm going to issue a special invitation to you that if you would like to come back here to North Beach tomorrow morning, I'm going to be preaching on evidences for the resurrection of Jesus. And so that's kind of like lecture part 2, but it will be in a worship environment. So if you want to hear more about that, and you have the opportunity, please make plans to come back tomorrow morning. We'll talk about that in just a moment. We look at the death of Jesus. Of course, the world around us during this week and next week, next Sunday being Easter, it's something that the world is thinking about, particularly at this time of the year. The death of Jesus was an event of worldwide significance. It was an event that had significance not only in Fort Worth, Texas for us today, but it is truly an event that has a worldwide significance. In fact, I would suggest to you this evening, and you may challenge me on this, and that's perfectly fine if you want to do that. We'll have that opportunity for questions and for discussion. But I would suggest to you this evening that Jesus as an individual has had more influence than any other single person who has ever lived on this earth. Okay? I'm going to say that again because I want that to sink in. I believe that Jesus has had more influence than any other single individual who has ever lived on this planet. And the influence that he has had is truly worldwide. It is not something that is just in our civilization, but in fact it is worldwide. It is everywhere. Even in parts of the world that are not predominantly Christian, Christian influence is very strongly felt, and the influence of Jesus is very strongly felt. So not just in what we call our civilization. When I say our civilization, I mean Western civilization, okay? Europe, North America. That's kind of what we think about when we think about the heartland of Christianity. It's interesting to me, and I'll just throw this out there, this is not a lecture on the spread of Christianity, but it is interesting to me that Christianity is spreading now faster elsewhere other than North America and Europe in the modern world. Christianity is actually spreading very quickly in places like Africa and places like Asia and places that were not historically Christian, if you will. That's where Christianity is spreading quite a bit. So Jesus is influential not just in our civilization, but truly everywhere in the world. Also, I think it's important for us to understand that Christianity is based primarily on belief in Jesus' death and resurrection. And I understand this evening we're not going to spend a lot of time on the resurrection. We will touch on it, and tomorrow morning I'm going to spend some more time talking about it. But Christianity is based on a belief that Jesus died, but Jesus is not dead now. And if right now you're sitting there thinking, well, I don't believe that. That's just silly. That's just crazy. Dead people don't raise from the dead. Well, then I'll invite you again to come back tomorrow morning where we'll talk about that, because the resurrection truly is central to our faith as Christians and to my faith as a Christian. So what is our goal this evening? What are we going to spend some time doing? We're going to spend some time hopefully having a deeper exploration of Jesus' death, Jesus' burial, and alleged resurrection. Don't please get upset about me using that word alleged. It's alleged because it's something that Christians believe, and I think there's a lot of evidence for it, but it is not something that we can prove historically. So it's an alleged resurrection. We're also going to spend some time this evening examining some historical artifacts that shed light on these events. They will be on the screen. Okay, I don't have any historical artifacts to share with you, although we're going to have a little bit later some, I'm trying to think of the word that's used when you bring something. And somebody just used this word with me the other day, and I can't remember what it is. Not show and tell, but hands-on. We're going to have some hands-on things later in the lecture. And finally, I hope, gain a greater appreciation of the biblical narrative, of what it is the Bible tells us about the death and the burial and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So that's our goal this evening. I am going to try to get us out of here by 8 o'clock. I will tell you, if you are here this evening and we keep going and you want to keep going, I'm good with that, okay? So if you can't, I understand that as well, but we're not going to turn the lights off right at 8 o'clock and shush everybody out. If you're here and you want to keep discussing, we'll keep discussing. All right, so let's go ahead and get into the lecture itself, and we're going to have a series of Bible verses as we go through this to kind of introduce each section that we're talking about. And the first verse that I'd like for us to just look at very briefly on the screen behind me is Luke chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. Luke chapter 3, verses 1 and 2, we read this: "In the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate being governor of Judea, the word of God came to John." I chose Luke chapter 3, verses 1 and 2 so that we could spend a little bit of time this evening talking about the chronology of Jesus' life. If you were here back in December when we had a lecture, you may remember, on the birth of Jesus, you may remember that as a result of the information we presented in that lecture, we understand that Jesus was born no later than 4 BC. I know that's an anomaly because BC in English means before Christ. And so it's kind of silly to say Jesus was born in the year 4 before Christ, but he really was, okay? We know because of when Herod the Great died. We know that on our calendar. We know our calendars are a little bit wrong, okay? And so we can shift the dates. It is just one of those kind of the funny happenstances, if you will, of history that Jesus was actually born before Christ. Sometime between 4 and 6 before Christ. So if you wanted to give kind of a round number, you could say 5 BC. I'm not going to be concerned if you use 4 BC, although you don't have a lot of time in 4 BC because Herod dies in 4 BC, and Herod is alive when Jesus is born. We know that from the gospel accounts. And so that's kind of an important date for us, 4 BC. We also read here in this text that Tiberius is the emperor of Rome when John begins his ministry. That's important because as we look at Tiberius was actually co-ruler with the Emperor Augustus from about 1112 AD. He was the sole ruler from 14 AD to 37 AD. So if you were looking on Wikipedia perhaps or some other source of information, you might find that Tiberius is listed as emperor from 14 to 37. That's true. However, it is also true that he was co-emperor, co-ruler with Augustus already starting in 11 to 12 AD. That's important as we move forward and try to find a date. Because what that tells us, based on the text that we read, Luke chapter 3, what that tells us is that we're going to get a date of either 26 AD or 29 AD for the start of John's work. It depends upon whether Luke is dating his chronology in chapter 3 based on when Tiberius is sole ruler or when he is co-ruler with Augustus, okay? Now, if you were sitting out there saying, what difference does it make? I will agree with you that probably in the overall scheme of things, it doesn't make that much of a difference, except I'm the kind of guy that likes to set the setting in a time and a date. And so that's why I'm doing that this evening. So we have Tiberius ruling. I believe, based on the evidence that I look at, that probably the early date is what we need to be counting from. And so that means that we get some other information in the New Testament. Jesus, we are told in Luke chapter 3, verse 23, was about 30. I emphasize that word about because that's exactly what Luke writes. He writes he was about 30. He doesn't say he was exactly 30. He says he was about 30 when his ministry began. And from the gospel accounts, we can kind of piece together that Jesus had a ministry that lasted about 3.5 years, okay? We're dealing with abouts here, approximations. So that tells us that Jesus' ministry would have started in about 26 AD, and the crucifixion took place in 30 AD. And so for my purposes this evening, as we introduce this topic, that's the year that we're looking at. We're looking at 30 AD for the death of Jesus. I understand that sometimes you will see 33, completely understandable if you are taking Tiberius being dated from when he is sole emperor. But if we take it from when he is co-emperor, and we understand the information about when Jesus was born, to me it's much more reasonable, based on the evidence, that Jesus would have died in about 30 AD. That's a long time ago. We're coming up quickly on what would be the 2000th anniversary of Jesus' death. When we get to the year 2030, that would be 2,000 years since Jesus died. And even today, nearly 2,000 years later, Jesus' death, again, is still a very significant event for our civilization and indeed for the entire world. So that kind of sets the stage, if you will, as to when these events are taking place. The second verse that I'd like to share with you all this evening is from the Gospel of John, and it's John chapter 19, verse 16. And in that verse we read this: "So he delivered him over to them to be crucified." The he there is Pontius Pilate. We're going to look at him in just a moment. He delivers him, that's Jesus, over to the Jews in order that Jesus can be crucified. I want us to spend some time looking at Jesus' trials, specifically 6 trials. Jesus undergoes 6 trials before he is actually then executed. This all comes about because of the unique situation of Judea under Roman rule. They're ruled by the Romans. A lot of Jews were not very happy about that. But because they're under the rule of the Romans, there are some things they can do, and there are some things they can't do. So, for example, Jews are able to find a person guilty of violating Jewish law. They're able to do that. And so they're able to have trials before their high priest or before their Sanhedrin, their council, and they're able to determine as a result of that trial that this individual is guilty of violating the Jewish law. However, they're not able to actually execute someone for having done that. And so when the Jews would find someone guilty, they're going to have to hand them over to the Romans, because it is only the Romans who could issue and carry out a death sentence. Okay? The Jews couldn't do that. Now, I know that you may be sitting there thinking, well, what about Acts chapter 6, when Stephen is taken out and stoned to death? That's a good example to use if we're understanding that sometimes there's the way things are done legally, and then there's mob action. Stephen being stoned to death is a result of mob action, not a result of a trial. There's no trial there at all. He's talking to that group of people, and they get mad, and they haul him out and start stoning him to death. Jesus' situation is very different. The Jews are very upset with the Jewish leaders are very upset with Jesus, but they are going to be very, very careful to follow correct procedure so that if they can get Jesus killed, they're going to have done it correctly, if you will, at least in their mind. All right? So Jesus is going to undergo trials that are religious in nature. He's going to undergo trials that are civil in nature as well. So let's look at these separately. We have the religious trials, and remember there are 6 in total. 3 religious, 3 civil. The 3 religious trials, the first one is between a fellow whose name was Annas. Annas is the titular high priest. That means he's the high priest in title. He's the official high priest, if you will, but he had been removed by the Romans, and someone else had been put in his place. Actually, his son-in-law had been put in his place as high priest. So Annas is still an individual who has a lot of respect among the Jews because he's actually the high priest, or he should be considered that way, even though he isn't serving in that way. He's going to see Jesus. Then we have Caiaphas, who is the actual high priest. He's the one that the Romans put in place of Annas, and he's Annas' son-in-law. So they're really kind of, the same family by marriage, but Caiaphas is the one that we usually think of most of the time when we think of Jesus' religious trials, because he's the one that's actually serving as high priest. It would be a little bit like, and it is only a little bit like, we still refer to every former president as what? President, right? Sometimes we say former president, but they've kind of got special significance when they have that title. But we understand that George Bush is not currently the President of the United States. We understand that Joe Biden is not currently the President of the United States, but they're still afforded the respect of those titles. So it's a little bit similar with Annas and Caiaphas. The third religious trial that Jesus is going to undergo is before the Sanhedrin, which was a council comprised of priests and religious leaders. So it's first before Annas, then it's before Caiaphas, and then it's going to be before the whole Jewish council. So the leadership collectively. Those are the trials that Jesus is first going to undergo. So as we look at these, I can't share really anything about Annas, except to say this. When Jesus is before Annas, he is found guilty of violating Jewish law. Then he is sent off to Caiaphas. Caiaphas finds Jesus. Anybody like to hazard a guess? Going to have to get you all talking this evening or we'll have no questions. Guilty, not guilty. What do you think? Caiaphas finds him guilty or not guilty? Raise your hand if you think he found him guilty. Okay, that's most of us, so we'll leave it at that. Indeed, Caiaphas does find Jesus guilty. And then Jesus is before the Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin will find Jesus guilty as well. So 3 religious trials. Before Annas, before Caiaphas, before the Sanhedrin, and every single time they find Jesus guilty of having violated the law of Moses. Guilty of blasphemy is the technical charge that is laid against him. So I can't say anything else about Annas, but we can look a little bit about Caiaphas. Caiaphas, this individual that we're going to call Caiaphas this evening, his full name is actually Joseph Caiaphas, so we kind of know him by his last name, if you will. He is high priest of the Jews from 18 to 36 AD, so he will serve as high priest about 18 years. And of course, whether you're a fan of the 30 AD date or the 33 AD date, either way you look at it, Caiaphas is the high priest. The trial before Caiaphas took place at night and involved the use of false witnesses. So we know that from the New Testament records. So Jesus is arrested very late at night. He's brought in for trials. These trials are taking place at night. In the case of the trial before Caiaphas, false witnesses are brought in before the Sanhedrin. False witnesses are used to get a conviction of Jesus. Interestingly enough, this fellow Caiaphas is actually known from the historical record. Sometimes we have people that are mentioned in the New Testament and in the Old Testament, and that's all we know about them, what the Old Testament or the Bible tells us. Caiaphas is one of these interesting individuals that we actually get some information about him, or at least we get confirmation of his existence outside of the New Testament, outside of the written record. And so I'm going to share one of those artifacts this evening that tells us, or confirms, if you will, the existence of Caiaphas. This is the Caiaphas ossuary, okay? And if you're looking up there and you're saying, well, that's a really pretty box, it is a really pretty box with a really unpretty purpose. The purpose of an ossuary was to serve as a collection point for bones. In the first century, in Judea, specifically around Jerusalem, when people died, their bodies were buried in a tomb. We're going to look at that later. Their bodies are buried in a tomb, but you know, there's a lot of people dying in that area, and it kind of gets hard to bury all these people. So there would be a family tomb. An individual's body would be buried, and about a year later, when the flesh had decayed, the family would go into the tomb, they would gather the bones of the individual, and they would often place them in a box that looked like that. It's called an ossuary. It's a bone box, if you will. This particular ossuary actually belonged to Caiaphas. There's an inscription. His name is actually mentioned twice on the ossuary. This particular artifact was discovered in 1990 in Jerusalem. In terms of archaeology, 1990 is yesterday, okay? This is so new. I was in college in 1990, all right? Some of you may look at me and say, well, that's ancient history, right? Not quite, but discovered in 1990 in Jerusalem. It was discovered in an archaeological dig. That's important. It's not a fake, okay? And there's no indication at all that there would be anything fake about this particular ossuary. It is very ornate. We're going to see another ossuary in a little while that doesn't look anything like that. What this tells us is that this was a family of good financial means, okay? Poor families weren't doing things like this. They couldn't afford it. Wealthy families did, and so they could and they did, all right? So this particular bone box is pretty ornate, belonged to a wealthy family, a family of standing, discovered in 1990. The name Caiaphas is inscribed on that box twice, okay? So there's no question at all of this box having something to do with Caiaphas. This particular box contained the bones of 6 individuals, including those of an elderly man. And because I know someone is going to ask me this, I went ahead and got the information. 2 infants, 2 teenage boys, 1 adult woman, and 1 man about 60 years old. Now, assuming the family didn't come later and dump out Caiaphas's bones somewhere and put someone else in there, and forget to write on the box who's inside, those bones of that 60-year-old man are probably Caiaphas's bones. Okay? This is an interesting artifact. If you want to see it today, you've got to go to Israel because it's in Israel today. Ivana and I, years ago, and I hope I'm getting the dates right, years ago when she was pregnant with Anna, shake your head yes and say that's right. She says that's right, okay. Years ago when she was pregnant with Anna, Israel let that bone box go to Vienna to be on display. We happened to be living about a 3-hour bus ride from Vienna at the time in the Czech Republic. And so we went with a group of other Christians down to Vienna to see the exhibition. That's what I wanted to see. I wanted to see that bone box. And so we went down there and we got to see that. And I still remember that to this day. It was behind glass to keep people from touching it and things like that. But this is an artifact. This is something that tells us that yes, the Caiaphas that we read about in the New Testament was a real individual who really lived. Interestingly, when we're talking about bone boxes and we're talking about Caiaphas' family, we have yet another bone box. This is Miriam's ossuary, or bone box, if you will. This particular ossuary was recovered in 2011. It had been looted from a tomb in the Elah Valley, which is not terribly far from Jerusalem. It had been looted from a tomb. It was recovered. Again, there are no questions at all about its authenticity. Okay, sometimes when things get looted, there's some questions about whether they're real or not. This particular bone box, there is not any question about it. The inscription on this bone box indicates that Miriam was Caiaphas's granddaughter. So in Jerusalem, we have archaeological evidence of Caiaphas. Outside of Jerusalem, we have archaeological evidence of his family. And I might just point out here that the family must have fallen on some amount of hard times. Or maybe Miriam wasn't that important, because when you compare that previous picture, the ornate engraving that's done on that stone, compare that to this. I mean, this is pretty ornate, but it's not as ornate as Caiaphas's was. So again, we have some archaeological evidence, historical evidence about the existence of Caiaphas. So let's go back to those trials. Remember, before Annas, he's found guilty. Before Caiaphas, he's found guilty. Before the Sanhedrin, he's found guilty. So all across the board, Jewish leadership has found Jesus guilty, and their assessment of that is he's worthy of death. The problem, of course, is for Jews in the first century is they can't do anything about that. Okay? We can't take Jesus out and execute him because that's something only the Romans can do. And so at this point in time, Jesus is shuttled off to the Roman authorities so that, well, hopefully, they're going to agree with what the Jews have already decided they want to do and will allow that to take place. So Jesus is sent to Pilate, who is the Roman governor of Judea at the time. Pilate is going to question Jesus. And let me just ask a question. At the end of that trial, is Jesus, and I'm going to ask you to raise your hands. We're going to take a vote on this. Is Jesus found guilty? Raise your hands. Or is Jesus found innocent? Raise your hands. Okay, the raised hands have it, because after the first trial, questioning before Pilate, Pilate's assessment is, why are we here? What is this all about? Jesus is innocent. Okay? But Pilate understands the Jews have sent this guy to me. Oh, by the way, you're from where, Jesus? You're from Galilee. Oh, that's convenient, because we've got a fellow here in Jerusalem that happens to be visiting right now whose name was Herod, not Herod the Great, okay? Not Herod the Great. So Pilate says, you know what? I'm going to punt this ball to someone else. He punts it to Herod Antipas. He says, hey, this fellow's from your jurisdiction, from Galilee. Why don't you, examine him and see whether he needs to be executed or not? So Herod's going to do that. Do I need to ask for a show of hands? No. Herod's assessment of Jesus is that he's innocent. It's kind of interesting because Herod didn't really like Jesus a whole lot. In fact, earlier in Jesus' ministry, Herod had wanted to kill Jesus, but he didn't. So now he has an opportunity. Jesus is before him. He has an opportunity to say, yeah, Pilate, you need to execute this guy. Herod doesn't do it. Instead, he sends him back to Pilate. So Pilate gets to try Jesus again for the 6th trial, the 3rd civil trial. Now I'll ask for a show of hands. So, innocent or guilty? What does Pilate determine at the end of this last trial? Raise your hand if you think Pilate found him innocent. Raise your hand if you think he found him guilty. Okay, I've got both hands, all right? Pilate actually finds him innocent. He examines Jesus, and he's still not seeing any reason why Jesus should be executed. So why is it, that being the case, Jesus ends up being executed? Because Pilate looks at this as a very pragmatic Roman. There's nothing really wrong with this guy, but the Jews really want him dead, and the Jews are really upset about us not passing sentence on him. And so what are we going to do? To keep everybody happy, to make sure we don't have a riot in Jerusalem. Nobody likes riots in Jerusalem. He hands Jesus over to be crucified, strictly for convenience. Not because the Romans care. They don't. Pilate looks at this guy and says, he's another Jew. This is really not my problem. But if the Jews want him that bad, take him and crucify him. So we look at these individuals, specifically Pilate. What can we say about Pontius Pilate? Pontius Pilate was Roman governor of Judea from 26 to 36 AD. So again, both of those dates that we would have for the death of Jesus fall squarely within the time period that he is governor. In addition to the New Testament references, the Jewish writers Josephus and Philo also mention him. So it's interesting that with Pilate, it's not just the New Testament, but also Josephus and Philo, who are not Christians at all, write about Pilate being governor. What's also interesting about that is you would think someone as important as Pilate would have left a lot of evidence, right, behind, because after all, he's mentioned in the New Testament, Josephus mentions him, Philo mentions him. Well, there wasn't any evidence for Pilate until 1961. When this particular artifact was uncovered. This is what's called the Pilate Stone. It dates to the early first century. It dates to the time of Pilate. It was discovered in 1961 at a place called Caesarea Maritima. There were lots of Caesareas in the New Testament period. This particular one is Caesarea by the sea, and it is northwest of Jerusalem on the Mediterranean Sea. And so they discover that particular stone. It dates again to Pilate's lifetime and has an inscription on it. And the inscription in English says this: to the divine Augusti, this Tiberium, Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, has dedicated this. Well, if you're looking at that and saying, well, there's a whole lot not said in that, you're right, there's a whole lot not said in that, because if you'll look very carefully at that stone, you'll see that there are sections that are missing that have been reconstructed. But Joan Taylor, who is a expert on these things, said this. She said that a Tiberium, what this is all about, is a dedicated structure in honor of the Emperor Tiberius. A res sacra, that's a Latin word, would easily be called in Latin a Tiberium. The most natural things in terms of the Latin word would be to consider this not to be some secular lighthouse for the help of sailors or any other profane building, but an edifice or annex associated with the Roman imperial cult. Roman emperors were worshipped as gods. And Pontius Pilate built some kind of a building there in Caesarea and puts this inscription there so that the Roman emperor knows, hey, I'm a really loyal citizen, a really loyal governor. See what I have done for you. Again, 1961, we get archaeological evidence of the existence of Pontius Pilate. We also have artifacts like this one. This is a bronze coin of Pontius Pilate. It was minted in Jerusalem, AD 29, AD 30. The obverse of this coin, that's that one right there, depicts 3 bound grain heirs and is inscribed, the coin of Julia, the wife of Caesar. The reverse, that's the side over here, depicts a sipulum, which is a libation ladle. If you're making a libation, worshiping a god or an emperor, you would use something like that, and is inscribed coin of Tiberius Caesar, followed by the date that's given there, and the 16th, and that would have been the 16th year of Tiberius. Okay, this was a coin that Pontius Pilate had minted there in Jerusalem. So we get evidence outside of the New Testament, outside of Philo and Josephus, that Pontius Pilate indeed lived. But the Pilate stone is really, really important because this is something that he himself had inscribed on this building that he built so that the emperors would know he was really loyal to the Roman government. All right, that's Pontius Pilate. Then we have Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas is kind of interesting. Remember, he's the guy that's ruling over Galilee. Pilate punts Jesus off to him and says, hey, why don't you take a look at this and see what you think about this? Pilate's looking for a way out. He doesn't get his way out, okay? Herod Antipas is the son of Herod the Great. Remember Herod the Great? He's the guy that dies before 4 BC, or he dies in 4 BC. And he's also the king that tried to kill Jesus after he was born. The baby boys of Bethlehem. You remember that from the last lecture. You remember that from the scriptures. So Herod Antipas is his son. He is tetrarch of Galilee and Perea from 4 BC to 39 AD. So he rules over Galilee and also another region called Perea. We'll see a map here in just a moment, for a pretty significant amount of time. It is this Herod that in the New Testament we read about had John the Baptist beheaded. Okay, so if you're thinking, which Herod was that killed John the Baptist? It's this Herod, Herod Antipas, okay? He had wanted to kill Jesus. He gets an opportunity to try Jesus, and he punts him back to Pontius Pilate. All right, I promised you a map. These are the lands that used to belong to Herod the Great. Herod dies, and the Romans divide up his territory. Antipas gets this area up here of Galilee, and he also gets this area over here, Perea. There's another area that intervenes between them, and then the green area that is going to, by the time of Jesus' trial, is going to be ruled by a Roman governor. Okay, so Herod Antipas, he's kind of the last, well, not the last, but he's one of those important vestiges of what had been before, but he's still very much under the rule, under the control of the Romans. So we read in Luke chapter 13 that he had threatened to kill Jesus. He doesn't carry that out. Pilate is sent to him. Again, because of the Gospel of Luke, we read this. He's sent to him because Jesus is from Galilee. This fellow later, he runs afoul of the Romans. I suppose in spite of his best intentions, he ends up making the Roman authorities mad. And so they decide to exile him. Okay? So if you're thinking later New Testament, John gets exiled to Patmos, which is this rocky desert island. No fun, not a great place to go. It's hard to have a lot of sympathy for Herod Antipas because he gets exiled to a place called Lugdunum Covinarum, which is in modern southern France. So he gets exiled to the French Riviera, okay? Rough place to spend your retirement, right? How many of y'all would just be terribly upset if you got sent to the French Riviera to spend your retirement? I'm not seeing any hands out there, okay? Well, that's where he ends up going much later on after these events. So that's Herod Antipas. Remember, Pilate tries him twice. Herod Antipas tries him once. We read about Herod Antipas outside of the New Testament. We have archaeological evidence of Pilate outside of the New Testament as well. That leads us to our next Bible verse this evening, which is Matthew chapter 27, verse 26. Then he released for them Barabbas, the he there is Pilate. He released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, delivered him to be crucified. So we're going to spend some time now talking about crucifixion and what this was all about. Crucifixion as a method of execution predated the Romans. Other nations had used crucifixion, but the Romans perfected it. And so much so that today when we think crucifixion, we think about the Romans because it's associated with them. But people before them had used it as well. Babylonians had used it. Assyrians had used something like it. It was really impalement. But the Romans took this and they perfected it. Okay? So crucifixion was used extensively in the Roman period. It was a form of execution that invoked terror, and served as a warning. When you were crucified under the Romans, it wasn't just about executing somebody for their crime. It was about executing them in such a way that everybody would see it, and everybody would take note, and everybody would think twice about violating Roman law. It was a method that was used primarily for slaves. Roman citizens generally were exempt, not always. Non-citizens of the Roman Empire could also be crucified. And if you're sitting there looking at that, well, foreigners and slaves. Well, foreigners and slaves were a huge part of the Roman Empire. You had people that lived there but were not citizens. They didn't have the same rights as everyone else. They might have been born there and lived their entire lives there. Slaves didn't have the same rights as everyone else. They might have been born there and lived their entire lives there. Roman citizenship was something that was special. People that had it really guarded it carefully. And they would use it carefully because, generally speaking, if you were a Roman citizen, you couldn't be crucified. But if you weren't, that was certainly something that was on the table. If I say the name Spartacus, is that going to ring a bell with anybody? Raise your hand if Spartacus means something to you. They've made like 2 or 3 movies, about Spartacus. Spartacus was a real guy. He was a real gladiator. He started a revolt, a slave revolt among the gladiators in Capua, which is south of Rome. He begins what's called historically the Third Servile War, which simply means the Third Slave Revolt. And he's really successful in fighting off the Romans. And if you've seen the Hollywood versions, you know that. They march all over southern Italy, they scare a whole bunch of Romans, and they free a whole bunch of slaves. But, of course, the problem is the Romans have legions, and so they're coming after Spartacus because they can't have this be successful. Eventually, they put down the revolt. This is not Hollywood. 6,000 of Spartacus's followers are crucified along the Via Appia, which is the road that leads from Capua, where the revolt started, to Rome. 6,000 men and women crucified along that road. You think the Romans were sending a message? Don't revolt again. If you don't like being a slave, tough. If you don't like being a gladiator, tough. Because it's not going to end well with you when we finally catch you. It was a means of execution that instilled terror in the population, especially the slaves and non-citizens. It was often preceded by scourging. Now, I'm going to tell you this evening, I probably should have given you a warning up front. If you've got a young child that listens very intently, this is probably going to be PG-13. You might come away saying it's R, But I think it's important for us to understand what all is involved in crucifixion and what all Jesus went through. And so if your kids are listening, they may have some questions. Send them my way or answer their questions at home. Crucifixion was often preceded by scourging. Scourging we sometimes call whipping someone. That doesn't quite do justice to what's involved. The victim was stripped naked. 2 or more soldiers would alternate taking blows against the victim from his back to his feet. We sometimes think of scourging as being just on the back. It was from the shoulders all the way down to the feet. And the individual was completely naked. The entire length of the body. The Roman whip itself was designed to inflict maximum pain but without causing death. They didn't want to beat a person to death. They wanted to crucify him. But sometimes the people died from the scourging. Okay? My understanding of these is that they were actually recovered in an archaeological excavation. They were a part of the Roman whip, and they were designed to cause tissue and pain damage during scourging with the flagrum. And I might just point out that you kind of look at those, they're a little dull. They've probably been used. Okay? They would be used perhaps in discipline in a military context. They were definitely used when someone was crucified. The idea of scourging, again, was to cause a great deal of pain, but not kill the individual, because the goal was then to crucify. How many of y'all ever saw the movie The Passion of Christ? Mel Gibson? Okay. I don't ever give any blanket recommendation, and I'm not giving really a recommendation for that particular movie. There's a whole lot in that movie that it's not biblical. Okay? There's a lot in that movie that is not biblical. But one thing that is pretty accurately depicted in that movie is the scourging. In fact, the actor that plays Jesus in that movie, he actually played in the scenes where he was being scourged. And what he did was he had a metal plate that was on his back, because obviously getting scourged would be, you wouldn't want your actor to get scourged for real. And so he wore a metal plate during the filming. One of the actors that played one of the Roman soldiers missed and hit the actor where the plate wasn't. He left a 12-inch gash in his body. All right? Talk about dedication to your role, right? It's pretty accurate in some of those depictions. All right, that's where we're going to stop. We're going to have an intermission. You're sitting there looking at your watches right now saying, wow, we're actually getting an intermission and we're not exactly halfway through. I put my little controller down and I have no idea where I put it. It's right up here. So we're going to take about a 10-minute break. I am going to watch my clock. If you need the restrooms, they're right back there. If you need some water fountain, it's right there as well. And we're going to get started here in about 10 minutes and we'll talk about crucifixion. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started in our second half. It's always nice to see everybody visiting together, and I know we've got some folks here that know folks from times past and times present. It's always nice to see that, but we're going to go ahead and get started with the second half. I think we're about at the midpoint. Okay, I want to emphasize again: if you've got some questions or comments, you don't have to wait for me to ask, because I'll probably get busy talking and I won't even ask. All you need to do is make it known that you've got some questions, and Austin's got the mic over there, and he'll get the mic to you so that you can ask that question out loud. I appreciate a lot of y'all have filled out those papers and put them in the basket. That is very helpful to us, and so if you haven't done that yet, I'd ask you to do that if you want to before you leave this evening. All right, so we left off kind of in the middle. Jesus has been handed over to be crucified. We talked about the scourging. We talked about crucifixion in general. That's kind of where I wanted to leave it before we got to the crucifixion itself, because once we get into that, then it'd be kind of hard to find a stopping place. So we remember that Pilate hands Jesus over to be crucified. The first thing that's going to happen before he's actually crucified, is he's going to be scourged. Okay, it's interesting that the New Testament, when it says that, it just says it as a simple statement. And it's kind of lost on us because we don't see people scourged today. Probably none of us in this room this evening have ever actually seen someone undergo that kind of a punishment. But in the New Testament period, all the readers of the New Testament would have understood exactly what that was. So again, the purpose of scourging was not to cause death. It was to cause intense pain. It was to inflict terror on those who would see that taking place. But crucifixion was then what was intended to bring about death. So let's talk about crucifixion itself as a form of execution. Crucifixion was carried out in various ways. And so it is very difficult for us to make a blanket statement across the board. This is how crucifixion was done. There were various methods that were used. There were some things that were done differently from time to time and place to place. But there are still some things that we can say about this particular method of execution. In crucifixion, the victims could be men and women. Women were not exempt from this. Remember when Spartacus led his revolt, when the 6,000 at the end are captured, there are both men and women who were crucified. Women were crucified in the Roman Empire. It was not common because women generally were not committing crimes. But it certainly was on the table that a woman could commit such a crime as to end up being crucified. The victims of crucifixion could take hours or even days to finally die on a cross. From the gospel records, we know that Jesus does not spend days on the cross. As a matter of fact, he is crucified in the morning, and by the afternoon, before sundown, he has already died. But there were plenty of other victims who might have been on the cross longer than that. Crosses themselves took various forms, but the textual information that we have in the New Testament actually give us an idea of what Jesus's cross looked like. And so we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about that by using this particular Bible verse kind of as an introduction. Matthew chapter 27, verse 32, as they went out, they found a man of Cyrene, Simon by name, and they compelled this man to carry that's Jesus's cross. So Jesus is bearing his cross to the place of execution. He's not able to carry the cross the whole way. And so the Romans choose this guy out of the crowd. They point to him and they say, you get to carry this man's cross. Sometimes what we see in the modern world is we see depictions of people who, for various reasons, carry a cross. Maybe you've seen that. I remember very well growing up as a very young child in California, that a fellow walked into our assembly in California, and he was dressed in robes and sandals, and I believe he left the cross outside that he was carrying. But he was going across the countryside carrying a cross. I've seen some that actually had wheels on the bottom as they're walking across the country carrying these crosses. That's not exactly what we have going on here. What's going on with Jesus is that he's being crucified in a very typical way, for Romans to do during this period. So, what the Romans are doing is they would have a stake. They had a word for that. The word in Latin is a stipes. So they would have a stake that was permanently installed at execution sites. Enough people were crucified with enough regularity that the Romans would keep places that would be used regularly for crucifixion. And the stakes would be left permanently installed there so that they were ready to be used. So the stipes is there. The victim would then carry the crossbeam. They had a word for that too. The word was patibulum. They would carry the crossbeam to his execution. And then once they arrived at the site of the execution, then that crossbeam would actually be attached to the stake. That helps us, understanding what we read there in the text, that Jesus is carrying his cross. It helps us to understand that this was the method that's being used when Jesus was crucified. So he's not carrying the whole cross, he's carrying that beam. Now, lest you think that, well, that's not so bad, right? Don't think a 2x4. Don't even think a 4x4. It was probably substantially larger than that. And remember, Jesus has been scourged. So that what we read in the text is that he is already in such bad shape that someone has to be compelled to carry that crossbeam. We do get some archaeological evidence of crucifixion. There's not a whole lot, but this is one that I found to be particularly interesting. This is it's graffiti. That image right over there is graffiti. It's from a Roman hostel in Puteoli, Italy. It dates to the 2nd century AD. And so you've got somebody who was staying in the hostel, and for whatever reason, they decided to depict a crucified individual. And they did. They, just like, you know, you're out there at the Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad, and somebody's out there with spray paint, and they're spray painting. This guy makes an engraving on the walls here in this Roman hostel. The photographer is a man whose name is there on the screen for you, but there's a drawing of what we find in the stone. And it's kind of interesting because what you see here is you see the crossbeam. That's that patibulum. That's what Jesus would have carried. You have the stake as well that is in the ground, and you have the individual who is on the cross. I'm just going to direct your attention down here to his feet. We're going to come back to that. Okay? How his feet are nailed to the cross. But I really am hoping that we're going to get Austin to do a little walking for us. Because I want you to tell me what you see in that really stands out. This should scream at you. Right over here, if you would, Austin.
Looks like scourgings throughout the body.
Exactly what I would hope that you would find in the picture. This man is not, when you look at that at first, it looks like, I don't know, he's got tiger stripes or something, right? No. He had been scourged. This is not Christian artwork. This is pagan artwork. This is somebody who happened to be traveling through Puteoli, Italy, staying at that hostel, and he had seen this, and he depicts it. You've got all the tears and the rips of the scourging. And it is going, as I said earlier in the lecture, from shoulder all the way down to his legs, okay, across his entire back. And by the way, it's the backside that then is nailed to the cross. He's nailed with his backside to the cross is what I mean, okay? So this is a depiction from the 2nd century. This was something that people in these centuries where Jesus is crucified, they saw it. This wasn't carried out like executions are carried out in Texas. If the state of Texas puts someone to death, they put them to death in the death chamber down in Huntsville. Very few people get to witness that. Usually family members of the victim, family members of the person who's being executed, and some other people that are selected to be witnesses to what's going on. It is not done in the public square. It's not done in front of the Tarrant County Courthouse. It's done in a pretty private location. The Romans did this in a very public location because they wanted people to see and note. You kind of have to wonder, as you think about this guy who's traveling through Puteoli, and he etches that into the wall. You kind of have to wonder, was that his brother? Was that his friend? Was that somebody who he knew? And he's depicting them in this way as a way kind of dealing with what he had seen. But we get that particular piece of evidence. We look farther at this. In crucifixion, the victim's feet were nailed to the stake. We'll talk about that in more detail here in a moment. The hands were tied or nailed or even both to the crossbeam. So you have the stake that's in the ground, the feet are nailed to the stake. The hands are nailed or tied or both to the crossbeam, the part that Jesus would have carried. Jesus, in fact, is nailed to the crossbeam through his hands and wrists. We know that. John chapter 20, verses 25 and 27 tell us that. So it's not just, Jesus isn't just tied to the cross, he's nailed to the cross. That left a permanent mark on his body. Death occurred in crucifixion from a combination of shock and asphyxiation. A person on a cross either died from lack of water, from the eventual effects of the scourging and the blood loss, or they died because they could no longer breathe. Okay. We have a question over here, Austin, if you would.
Thank you. Does the evidence indicate the attachment would they lay, the stake down and attach them to both and then stand up, drop it in the hole, or were the stakes permanently upright?
I don't think there's any evidence saying one way or the other. It might really have depended upon how it was carried out in that particular location. Sometimes the exact method of crucifixion would vary from military unit to military unit. Crucifixions were carried out by military units. Okay, these were Roman soldiers that were doing this. Unfortunately, they generally got pretty good at what they were doing. So whether it was a stake that was dropped into the hole, I can kind of picture the depiction that you're thinking about, or whether it was permanently there and the individual is just nailed to it after having been lifted up to the top. I don't think there's any evidence one way or the other in that regard. So it kind of leaves it open to conjecture. Okay. So they would die of shock or asphyxiation. Okay. You might ask yourself, how do they die of asphyxiation? How do they die from not being able to breathe? On a cross, you would have to push up with your feet in order to breathe. But pushing up on your feet, as you're going to see and imagine in just a moment, would have been extremely painful. And so once you could no longer do that, you would let go and go back down. And then you couldn't breathe. So how long can you go without breathing before you decide, I'm going to have to push up again? We think of crucifixion as an individual just hanging there on a cross. Individuals who were being crucified were in constant motion, up and down and up and down, until they could no longer push up. And then they died. Crucifixion was not carried out on crosses that were 10 feet or 15 feet high. They were carried on crosses that were just a little bit above eye level. People could see them. People could walk by them. People could make fun of them and mock them if they so chose. And we see that in Jesus' case, they did that. They mocked Jesus while he was on the cross. So death would occur from these things. If the Romans wanted to have someone die more quickly, they had a way of doing that. Okay? They would break their legs. So a person who was on a cross, again, is pushing up in order to breathe. If they wanted the individual to die quickly, they would have a very large metal rod or wooden rod. Think about a baseball bat. And they would break the individual's legs. And at that point in time, the individual could no longer push up and they would die. They even had a term for that. Okay, they didn't just say breaking the legs. They called it a crurifragium. If you're seeing the word crucifixion in there, you're correct. Fragium, a fracture. Okay, so they broke the legs of the crucified victim so that they would die. Interestingly enough, when Jesus is crucified, he's crucified with two other individuals. Those two individuals are still alive. The Jews want him off the cross before the next day starts. It's the Passover. And so they request that Pilate give the order for these people to be taken down. Two of them have their legs broken because they're still alive. Jesus, however, is already dead. And so his legs are not broken. That's what we read in John chapter 19, verses 32 and 33. So the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first and of the other who had been crucified with him. But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. We get some literary references to crucifixion. We get some illustrations, not very much, but like the one from Puteoli. We actually have very scant archaeological evidence because victims were seldom buried. In fact, we have two pieces of evidence that I'm going to share with you this evening, one of which I suspect some of you have already seen, one of which I suspect for most of you is going to be pretty new because it's pretty recent. We're going to start with that one first. This individual was found buried in England along with other people. Okay, it was a cemetery. And the place in England is called Finstanton. Don't ask me where it is, I'm not sure. It's probably a small place, but they're building a housing development, or they were. And as is the case in a lot of places in the world, if you're building a housing development, or you're building a building, or you're building a road, you have to carry out archaeological surveys as you're doing that. And so when they're digging in the ground, they find something, and they know they found something old, they have to stop. The government comes in with archaeologists, and they do a dig. It's usually a rescue dig. It's done very quickly so that construction can go on. They do this all over the place, okay? They do it in the Czech Republic. They do it in England. They do it in Israel, all right? So that's what's going on in Finstanton. They're building this development, and as they're digging, they find a cemetery. Oops, we got to stop. Now we got to excavate, see what's going on here so that we don't destroy a really important archaeological find. They found in the cemetery this particular individual. And you might be looking at that and you might be saying, well, what's significant about him? Well, they didn't know anything was significant about him when they excavated the body until they cleaned it up in a lab. And then they found what was really significant about this fella, and it's right down there. Of course, that's his foot. I'm going to give you an enlarged version of that. Now, I will tell you these photos are courtesy of Albion Archaeology. I actually reached out to them by email and said, I'm going to do a lecture. Can I use these photos? And they said, absolutely. And sent them to me in high res, which is great because I can do that. So you're looking at that foot and you're saying, okay, what's all that? And I'm giving you an arrow there and you're saying, okay, it's pointing to a bone, right? No, it's not. It's pointing to a nail, a really large nail, okay, embedded in the bone. And immediately when the archaeologists came across that, they realized we have found something very significant and very unusual because you don't find a lot of these in the archaeological record. Now we're going to go even closer into the bone. That is the heel bone of this particular man. Okay, the remains are dated 130 to 360. He is given an age, I'm going to have to look at my notes here. He is given an age of, well, I thought I had it, but I didn't write it down. Okay, not an old fella. Okay, this is probably, I think he was in his 20s or 30s, relatively young. That's his heel bone. That's the nail driven through the heel bone. Interestingly, as archaeologists were studying this, because this is an incredible find for archaeologists, what they determined was, as they're looking at that bone, and I understand we can't see it in the photo, is that a smaller indentation, and it would be on the back side of that bone, right there. A smaller indentation was found, and I'm quoting from them, next to the main hole, suggesting an initial attempt to nail him to the cross had misfired. This fellow was alive while they're doing that. They start the nail in, and oops, not the right spot. Well, let's try again. And so they did. And they drove the nail through the bone. This is the heel bone. I'm going to show you all in just a moment what that was, if you're trying to picture what bone that is. Well, what's interesting about this is discovered, I want to give you the date. I think I have it here. It was discovered in 2017. Okay? 2017 is yesterday in archaeological terms. This was only, 7 years ago, 8 years ago, 7 years ago. 7 years ago, okay? What's interesting is that it's remarkably similar to that bone. That is also a heel bone. This particular heel bone, and you've seen this before, I bet. You've seen it if you've been in classes with me because I use this photo. We know this fellow's name. The one in Finstanton, we don't know his name. He's lost to antiquity. But we know this guy's name. His name was Yehohanan, and his dad's name was Haggakol. His bone was actually recovered in an ossuary, a bone box, okay? And it was labeled, it was inscribed, okay? 1968 is when it's found. It is the heel bone of a first century male. His age is about 24 to 28 years old. He would have been about 5 foot 6 inches in height, so about 4 inches shorter than me. Not particularly remarkable for his day and age, okay? Along with Finn Stanton, we have proof that at least in some rare cases, crucified victims were actually buried. Most of the time they were not. Most of the time when the Romans crucified someone, the body was taken down from the cross, it was thrown out. It was not even given a burial. But in the case of the individual at Finn Stanton, he's buried. In the case of Yehohanan, he's buried. And of course in the New Testament, who else is buried? Jesus is buried. Okay, so sometimes people will come along and say, well, it's nonsense. The Romans never allowed these people to be buried, so it's silly that the New Testament says Jesus was buried. Well, here we have evidence that indeed sometimes they actually did let people be buried. By the way, if you want to see that bone, that one. If you want to see the other one, you got to go to England. Okay, if you want to see that one, you're out of luck, because all you can see now in Israel is a replica. Because of the sensibilities of particularly Jewish, conservative Jewish folks, they don't display human remains. And so once they had made a replica of it, once they had studied it, it was buried at an undisclosed location. Okay? So all you can see is a replica of it today. But what they've been able to do is piece together some information. So this particular photo is a mock-up of how that would have been done. It demonstrates how the nail would have penetrated the heel bone, then passed into the wood of the vertical beam of the cross, the one that's left in place, okay? And I will just point out, we're going to go back to that photo, I will just point out that one thing that's interesting about this is that right there. We all know what that is. If you've hammered a nail, you know exactly what that is. Hammer a nail into a knot in the wood, and what happens? The nail bends, doesn't it? If it's a really weak nail, it's going to bend at the head. It might bend at the tip as well, and that's apparently what happened. And that's probably why that nail was not removed. Because in the ancient world, nails were valuable, and crucifixion nails were sought after, are you ready for this? As good luck charms. So if you wanted a good luck charm, try to get a hold of a nail that was used in a crucifixion. Just any crucifixion, didn't matter, because a lot of people were crucified. And you can have that nail. So the fact that this one is left in the bone probably is an indication there was no way to get it out without really mangling the body, which the family was not interested in doing. So we have the mock-up there of how it would have been done. That wood there is conjecture. Okay, there was some wood that was found with it, and they don't know exactly what that was about. But that's conjecture that there was wood put there, kind of like a washer on a screw, if you will, to keep the nail in place. All right. This is my mock-up. This depicts, according to the archaeological evidence, this depicts the position of feet during crucifixion. And I will tell you, that's not usually what we think about, is it? We usually think about the feet being crossed, one nail going through them from the front to the back to the wood. But our evidence from Finn Stanton and our evidence from outside of Jerusalem is that the feet were positioned on the side. So I got the permission of the elders to do this, okay, what I'm about to do, because I wanted their permission before I did it. And I'm going to leave these down here on the table. But this is a mock-up of a foot nailed to a cross. I also have an extra nail just like that one that I'll leave down here on the table as well. But you will notice that that nail would have gone through the heel bone. If you're wearing shoes that allow you to feel your heel bone, ladies, if you're wearing sandals or heels, you can do this. You can reach down there and feel your heel bone. The nail would have been driven through the bone and into the wood. This particular nail goes about 1.5 inches into the wood. I had to drill a hole. This is a medical model. And I had to drill a hole to make the nail go through it. But the individual, and this is not the size of a cross would have been larger than this. His feet, while he is alive and conscious, would have been nailed to the cross. Don't want that to do that. You can imagine the pain involved. Bone is living tissue. Beyond the nerves, the muscles, and the tendons that are all around this, the bone itself is alive. And it is nailed, not once, just on one side, but again on the other side to the other foot. So that the individual who is being crucified would have had a stake in between his legs, and there's no way to do this. He wouldn't have been touching anything. Okay? All he would be able to do would be to use his knees to extend up so that he could breathe. And imagine the pain then when he let go and went back down. And this was, by all indications, a fairly normal manner of crucifixion. And very likely the manner that Jesus was crucified, as his feet are nailed to the cross. I do that not for the value of shock, but because crucifixion becomes for us as Christians something sterile, bloodless, almost painless. And it was anything but those things. So the other thing I'm going to leave up here. Now, parents, if you've got kids and they want to see it, I'm fine with that. But you need to be here with them because these are sharp. Okay? This is the exact nail that I used here. And archaeological evidence seems to indicate that it would have been about that size. Okay? That's about 4.5 inches. And it is very sharp on the tip. And it would have been driven into the wood. One in each foot. Now, this particular nail that I'm also going to leave up here is probably too long. But it has the double head. That double head is based on the nail from Jerusalem. Okay, that there would have been wood there. I will tell you, I had 2 of these. I tried to figure out how to get wood there. I couldn't make it happen. So I don't know really whether that mock-up is accurate or not. That conjecture of what that wood was about, I couldn't get it to work. Okay, but you get a feel that it would have been a very, very long nail. And that would have been driven through. Okay, so I'm going to leave these up here. You can look at them, children only with parental supervision, so nobody gets hurt, okay, because they are rather sharp, and they are iron, so if you get poked, you're going to have to go get a tetanus shot, all right? So, forewarned is forearmed. So those are the feet. But the feet isn't the sum total of crucifixion, because the other aspect is the hand. So how in the world is the hand affixed to the cross? Usually how this is depicted is there's a nail through the wrist, or through the palm, I should say. That's usually how it's depicted. The reality is this structure of the body is not strong enough to support the weight of a body. So in all likelihood, the nail itself was driven through this position. There are 2 bones in our wrist. I know you know this, the radius and the ulna. And there's a spot right between there where the nail could go. So I did another mock-up of this that I will also leave on the table. So the individual would be crucified on an upright stake, 1 foot on one side, 1 foot on the other. And the crossbeam would have been like this, with the hand nailed between the bones. Again, we don't have the tissue and all of that there, but you know what's running through here. Muscles, nerves, arteries. The nail would have gone through that. That nail is smaller. Okay, I didn't use a big nail here, but it likely would have been a nail about that size. All the way through and into the wood. I couldn't use this nail here because of the size of the wood. All right? When you see that and you think about that, I gotta tell you, when I was doing this lecture and putting all this, I have to put it this way, putting all this information together, it was mind-boggling to me. And when I think about the Romans wanting to instill terror on people, that would do it. The thought that if I rebel against Rome and I fail, this is what's going to happen to me. This might happen to my wife. It might happen to my children. It might happen to my brothers and my father and everybody who's near and dear to me on a cross. Makes you think, doesn't it, whether it's worth it or not. Jesus, of course, did nothing to deserve this. And yet, he underwent this for us. Now, I will tell you that as we look at the hand particularly, it's interesting, there is no archaeological evidence yet from recovered bones. So the mock-up there and the drawing there is conjecture to a certain extent. We're pretty sure that structure of the body can't hold the weight of the body. So it requires something here. By the way, linguistically, Greek is using the same term for this entire area. So the wrist is a part of the hand. So there's nothing in the New Testament that tell us that it couldn't have been that way. So we have no archaeological evidence, probably because the nail doesn't go through bone. It goes through the foot bone, not through the wrist bone. And remember, what's special about crucifixion nails? Good luck charms. So if you can get the nail out and you're a Roman soldier, what do you get to do? Sell it on the side. Or give it to your good friend. Or whatever. Okay? So if you can get the nail out, you probably do. And it's not in bone, so it wouldn't have left a whole lot of evidence there of the crucifixion. Early artistic renditions are not always clear. Okay? So if you're thinking about artwork from the Middle Ages and earlier, they're not always clear as to how the person is attached to the cross. And it is also possible, if I can get that point to come off, that later artwork may simply build upon what was the popular view. This is probably a more accurate depiction of what crucifixion would have been like. And I didn't come up with this. Okay, this is information that I was able to put together from various sources. Okay, the method itself, again, I've said this earlier, probably varied from unit to unit. But the end result was always the same. No one survived crucifixion. Ever. If you were crucified, the intent was you were going to die. Might there have been a case here and there where the Romans changed their mind and brought somebody down off the cross and they lived? Maybe. But that was never the intent. The intent was when you heard that word that you had been sentenced to crucifixion, this is what you were going to undergo. And you had seen it happen to others if you lived in the Roman world. That's what Jesus underwent. Next Bible verse this evening, Matthew chapter 27, verses 57 and 58. When it was evening, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who was also a disciple of Jesus. He went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then Pilate ordered it to be given to him. Rather unusual, because most of the time, folks who were crucified were not buried. But Joseph went and asked for Jesus' body, and Pilate granted that request. So Joseph is going to make sure that Jesus' body gets buried. Very important for subsequent events. That required a certain amount of courage, because ultimately Jesus is being crucified because he's run afoul of the Jewish authorities. And Joseph goes, and Joseph is a wealthy individual and a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin. And he goes and says, I would like to bury Jesus' body. He goes along with another fellow who we read about in the New Testament, whose name was Nicodemus. They go together. The body is bound in linen clothes and spices and buried. We read that in John chapter 19, verses 39 and 40. So let's talk a little bit about that burial. Joseph uses his own new tomb. The text is clear about that. It was a tomb that Joseph had intended for his own use. And he gives it to Jesus, for Jesus to be buried there. Women, we find in Matthew chapter 27, witness the location, so they see where Jesus is buried. I want you to remember that. Joseph knows where his tomb is. The women know where the tomb is. The next day, the Jewish leaders ask Pilate to make sure that Jesus' tomb is sealed and guarded, because we don't want anything happening to the body. So the Jews know where Jesus is buried. The Romans know where Jesus is buried. Everybody knows where Jesus is buried. It's not a secret. Okay, just remember that. Then as we get later to the resurrection, and tomorrow morning if you come back for the lesson during our worship service. So let's talk a little bit about burial customs and methods. Okay, family tombs were cut into rock, or existing caves were used or enlarged. Okay, If you're thinking burying in the dirt, generally in first century, this area, that's not what they did. They buried in caves or in tombs. If they had one they could use, they used it. Otherwise, they would build one or dig one out. They would have burial niches for the bodies, and the number varied based on the size of the tomb. And of course, as we indicated earlier, they used ossuaries in first century Judea. That was something that was particular for that location and for that time. All right. So this particular tomb is called Herod's family tomb. I don't think it's really Herod's family. That's just what's called. This would have been a typical tomb of this type of the first century. And you will notice that you have the entry into the tomb. There's a channel here in the stone, and there is a very large round stone that could be rolled shut and rolled open. That was the door of the tomb. You wanted a door on your tomb because you didn't want people robbing the tomb, and you didn't want animals going in there and desecrating the bodies. Another point of this is that in Mark chapter 16 and verse 3, the women, as they're going on Sunday morning to finish the preparations for Jesus' burial, their concern is, how are we going to get in? Because the stone is really large and really heavy. Who's going to open it for us? Okay? And it turns out they didn't need to worry about that, but they're thinking about it as they're going there. Here's another rolling stone tomb. That is not the rock band. Please do not think that. I just realized that it sounds like that when I called it that. But it is a typical tomb, again, with that round stone that could be rolled and close the entrance. This particular one is near Megiddo. So outside of Jerusalem, it's in the northern, the central part of the country. Then we have another image. That is not me. Okay? I get some really great biblical photos from a guy that used to live over there, and he's a college professor, and he would have his students do all sorts of things. So that's either him or one of his students laying on this particular spot. There was a term for that. It's called an arcosolium. It's a recessed bench. So the body would be laid there. Notice in John chapter 20 and verse 12 we read, "And she saw two angels in white sitting where the body of Jesus had lain, one at the head and one at the feet." So it's a reference to this kind of niche in the tomb, Joseph's tomb. Then down here, we have what are called coke shafts. That's a Hebrew word brought into English. Those are the shafts that were used then for the bones. So you'd place the body here, and when the flesh decayed, the bones would be gathered, and they'd be placed in the tombs. Okay, in these shafts, in the ground. These are another stone, another tomb that had a rolling stone to open and close it, at a place called Kirbet Midras in Israel. And these are ossuaries in the location. So you've got those benches for the bodies, and then you've got the ossuaries that would be placed there, so the bones, instead of being thrown in a shaft, would be put in the ossuaries, and they might have been inscribed. These are very plain, okay? There may be inscriptions on them, but I don't see it. There certainly are not all the ornate carvings. Interestingly enough, when you look at Caiaphas, if you remember Caiaphas' ossuary, how ornate it was on one side, it's not ornate like that on every side, because part of it was made to be facing the back of the wall. So you don't need to carve in the back side because no one's going to see that anyways. You carve on the front side, right? This was the way people were buried. Jesus is buried in this way. Nothing unusual at all. He's placed in a tomb. Joseph knew where it was. The women knew where it was. The Jews knew where it was. The Roman guard knows where it is as well. And then it's sealed. And the Jews think Jesus is going to stay. The Romans don't care. And his disciples at this point in time are pretty confused. Because the women go on Sunday morning not to see the risen Jesus. They go to finish the burial preparations. Which leads us then to the resurrection. The last part of the lecture this evening. 50 days after Jesus' death, his disciples began proclaiming that he had risen from the dead. This was astounding. That all of a sudden, these men that had run away when Jesus was being crucified are now proclaiming in Jerusalem itself to a huge crowd of people that Jesus, in fact, was no longer dead. And that resurrection, and the fact of the resurrection, has been a basic foundational belief of Christianity from that time forward. And so this evening we're going to finish with 3 Bible verses. Haven't read a lot of longer scriptures, but we're going to read some now. The first one is in Acts chapter 2. Acts chapter 2, verses 22 through 32. This is that sermon there on the 50th day after Jesus was crucified. Men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested to you by God with mighty works and wonders and signs that God did through him in your midst. As you yourselves know, this Jesus delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men. God raised him up, loosing the pangs of death, because it was not possible for him to be held by it. For David says concerning him, I saw the Lord always before me, for he is at my right hand, that I may not be shaken. Therefore my heart was glad and my tongue rejoiced. My flesh also will dwell in hope. For you will not abandon my soul to Hades, or let your Holy One see corruption. You have made known to me the paths of life. You will make me full of gladness with your presence. Brothers, verse 29, I may say to you with confidence about the patriarch David that he both died and was buried, and his tomb is with us to this day. Being therefore a prophet, and knowing that God had sworn with an oath to him that he would set one of his descendants on his throne, he foresaw and spoke about the resurrection of the Christ, that he was not abandoned to Hades, nor did his flesh see corruption. This Jesus God raised up, and of that we are all witnesses. That's an astounding claim to make if the body is still in the tomb. Can you imagine for just a moment that Peter and the apostles are standing there in Jerusalem and they're preaching that Jesus has been raised from the dead, and the Sanhedrin sends a cohort of men over to the tomb and says, bring that body in here. Let's end this once and for all. If they had done that, none of us would be here tonight. We wouldn't be in this room. We wouldn't be talking about the death of Jesus. Had they done that, this whole Jesus thing would have stopped. It would have finished. It wouldn't have gone a day further. But they didn't. Because they couldn't. Because the tomb was empty. So if we read on in the New Testament, if we go to the book of 1 Corinthians, notice what Paul had to say about this. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 through 8, he says, For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James and to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. I delivered as of first importance. Christianity stands and falls with the resurrection of Jesus Christ. If Jesus is not raised, if the tomb is still occupied, if Jesus did not ascend into heaven, everything that we as Christians do and believe is absolutely pointless. It was of first importance. If you're there in chapter 15, look with me at verses 12 through 19, and with this we'll finish. Now, if Christ is proclaimed as raised from the dead, how can some of you say that there is no resurrection of the dead? But if there is no resurrection of the dead, then not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain and your faith is in vain. That's what Paul says. If Jesus is not raised, then our faith is vain. We are even found to be misrepresenting God because we testified about God that he raised Christ, whom he did not raise, if it is true that the dead are not raised. For if the dead are not raised, not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile and you are still in your sins. Then those also who have fallen asleep in Christ have perished. And notice verse 19, if in Christ we have hope in this life only, we are of all people most to be pitied. So when Christians spread throughout the world, they preached the death of Jesus as an atonement, and they preached the resurrection of Jesus as the first fruits of what will come for those who follow him. I appreciate your attention this evening. That's the lecture. I just want to finish with some things here, just some things by way of important, by information. We're going to have a congregational singing here on Saturday, May the 3rd. Whoops, did not want it to do that. It's going to start at 6 and it's going to go to 7:30. There are some flyers on the table, some cards on the table. I do not know. Oh, I know why it's doing that. I'm going to have to keep doing that because I took that out of the slideshow and it's got an automatic advance. Or I'm just done talking about it. Okay? Tomorrow morning, if you happen to be here, we're going to talk about some evidence for the resurrection. We didn't talk about that a whole lot tonight, but we are going to talk about that tomorrow during the sermon. And then finally, because it's going to keep right on rolling, our schedule of services. So Sunday, tomorrow, 9 a.m. for Bible class, 10 a.m. for worship, again, worship at 5, and then we have Bible class at 7 p.m. That's it for the lecture. However, we still have a microphone and we still have time. So if you've got some questions that you'd like to ask, maybe something that you'd like me to explain a little bit better, feel free to do that at this time. If there aren't, we'll finish. I would invite you to come up and have a look at the things up here on the table. You're welcome to do that. Just don't poke yourself with them because they're a little sharp. All right? Any questions? Okay. I appreciate y'all coming this evening. The good thing is it's that time of the year. It's not dark out there, so you get to drive home in the light. I do hope that all of y'all will have a safe journey home, and I do hope that I'll get to see you again, that you'll come back and visit us either at a future lecture or perhaps at one of our worship services. Thank y'all. Oh, we have a question. So actually, he's going to bring the mic up to you.
I want to talk to you. I'd like to ask a couple of questions. And it seems as if I'm the only one. It's like, okay, I have all of your attention.
Oh, no, that's okay. We had some other questions too. Privately or here in the group?
Just there. I mean, I didn't want to take up too much time, or I wanted to feel comfortable enough to go over a couple of questions.
Okay, we'll come on up.
All right.
And we'll talk together. Thank you, Austin. I'll come to you. How about that?